historical faces, we'll say. People have been around for a while. I didn't want to say old.
Historical is worse.
Historical probably is worse, yeah. That's better than ancient. So what we'll do is we've got a pretty full agenda. The goal of today is to get through the topics that we want to cover and kind of give some assignments and give feedback get feedback from you all as to what we want to do. So without further ado, the top points. I knocked the microphone over. I wanted to say, first of all, thanks to Charla for this awesome space. It's really nice to be in an open space where we have food. The other thing is I want to mention is that the incentive auction is still ongoing, and you all know what that means. If you need anything more, see Charlotte.
Don't see.
No. Having said that, Len Bechtel will be giving our welcome. So Len, he is the Chief Financial Officer and acting and in the role supporting the, I got it written down someplace. He's performing the duties of the Assistant Administrator. So Len.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. The beginning of a year and the beginning of a new administration is often a good time to both look backwards and forward. And today's agenda, I think, does that. But from the perspective of NTIA and the CSMAC, I think if we look over the history of the CSMAC over the last 13 years or so, we have to think about advisory committees in the federal government. They come and they go. This one now has a history, and I think as we move forward, I want to express the appreciation from NTIA for the contribution of the CSMAC. It is obviously something that NTIA values very much, and the perspectives and information that you bring to the discussion of issues that come before the CSMAC is something that is needed, because we're dealing with issues that aren't always simple. And so having those multiple perspectives is very important. And I want to express on behalf of NTIA, our appreciation for all that you do. Looking forward, we do have a new administration. I may be only here one meeting. Because we, at some point in time, a new Assistant Secretary will be nominated by the Trump administration, and we will have new leadership at NTIA. What that means for NTIA and for the CSMAC, is yet to be seen. But what we do know is that, when we have the opportunity, we will express the value that we think the CSMAC brings to the table to the new administration. So again, I want to express our appreciation to you today, and turn it over back to the chair. We do have a pretty exciting, well, as meetings go, a pretty important set of issues to discuss today.
No, it's exciting. Spectrum's exciting. But I shouldn't have said, my name is Mark Gibson. I co-chair this with Larry Alder, and Larry will have remarks in a moment. Glenn, you're next.
Sure, I'd just like to follow on a couple things that Len's mentioned. I'm still Chief of Staff for NTIA. Happy New Year. There's certainly plenty of change going on around. We had this first meeting of a new year. We have a number of new members. We have a new administration. And I particularly want to say thanks to the 10 new members who are joining us and express our appreciation for their willingness to serve and to provide your new views and insights and expertise. Amidst all this change, however, I believe there's nothing but continuity with respect to CSMAC itself. A great deal has been accomplished over the past several years, as Len mentioned, towards the goal, towards the mission of CSMAC, which is figuring out ways and providing advice on how to use Spectrum more efficiently. Everyone here is deeply familiar with all the successes we've had over the last several years, but I think what's somewhat less appreciated is what CSMAC's contribution has been to those efforts. A couple examples of sort of the direct impacts that we've identified. Obviously, CSMAC's work on effective sharing solutions was a major contributor to the success of the AWS-3 auction. The committee's work on incentives has led to recommendations for increased flexibility for agencies to utilize the Spectrum Relocation Fund, several of which were implemented in the 2015 Spectrum Pipeline Act. CSMAC's report on spectrum management via databases, for example, has informed NTIA's ongoing assessment of expanding our web-based portals into other bands, including the FCC's efforts to provide access to more spectrum for fixed backhaul. And NTIA is continuing to follow up on a number of the CSMAC's recommendations by funding and undertaking new work at our Boulder labs, including further analysis and measurement in the 1300 to 1390 megahertz band, as well as several projects aimed at improving approaches to enforcement. While these tangible contributions have been important, I believe a great deal of the impact of CSMAC has to date actually been more indirect. By bringing together a group of smart, influential leaders representing a variety of viewpoints, CSMAC has been an essential element in helping reshape how we are going to approach spectrum management in the U.S. The legacy of this work is that we are building a process based on sound technical analysis to balance the variety of spectrum uses for the public's benefit. Sharing is clearly a part of that legacy and a pillar for the future, and the work of CSMAC will continue to inform those efforts. Moving forward, I believe that the past truly is prologue here. As Len mentioned, we don't have any unique insights as to whom or when we will have leadership within NTIA. I suspect some of you in the room have better insights than we do. You can corner Brian at the bar afterwards. But if you watched Secretary-designate Ross's confirmation hearing, it left little doubt that ensuring more efficient use of spectrum will continue to be a priority for him, for the department, and for Congress. Indeed, a number of the topics that you will consider taking on today, including incentives and 5G standards, were specifically raised in the course of Mr. Ross's confirmation hearing. CSMAC's input on these issues will continue to be not just relevant, but influential. Without prejudging today's deliberations of topics and questions, we can observe some of the challenges and opportunities that lie before us. Exploring the 5G technologies and standards that will pave the way to realize the promise of 5G and IoT. CSMAC has already done a lot of work in this area, and it will be important to review and discuss how to carry on that work, particularly on issues such as interference prevention and sharing. A related opportunity is the question of how to approach enforcement in a sharing context, particularly how to automate enforcement in a manner that avoids the downsides of ex post enforcement. I suspect Dale may have a couple comments on that issue. As NTIA renews and strengthens our processes for selecting bands to consider for potential repurposing, can CSMAC bring its expertise to bear to provide input on how best to access and prioritize or value particular spectrums or bands or ranges? I think it's clear, as we've seen over the last year with respect to the Spectrum Frontiers order and some other, the auction that will go unnamed, that there is changes in how the industry and others are valuing spectrum, what the spectrum needs are of the industry. How do we better inform ourselves as to how those spectrum bands are valued and what we should focus our energies on. Examining whether there is a budding divergence between U.S. economic spectrum policies and those being pursued internationally is an important issue. Recent ITU World Radio Communication Conferences have featured contentious debate over UHF spectrum, 5G, UAS, and Earth stations in motion, among other issues. Does it matter if the United States leads but others do not follow? And how can we further integrate our policy goals with those of our allies and trading partners? Stimulating a conversation and a systematic examination of how we train and mentor future spectrum policy and management experts, including lessons learned from industry and academic recruiting policies. And finally, looking closely again at whether and how incentives can be applied to federal spectrum use in order to promote any gains in efficiency or to identify any potential opportunities for further spectrum sharing or other repurposing. In the next few hours, I expect you all will begin honing on these topics and potentially others into focused research questions for the new term. I thank you again on behalf of NTIA, the Department of Commerce, and the new leadership, and we look forward to your guidance. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Glenn. And thanks for calling us all smart people.
Did I say everybody? I'm sorry.
Maybe including. Okay, excellent timing. So what we'll now do is go around and introduce ourselves. We'll start with Charlotte and go around clockwise. Just say who you are and who you're with, and we'll keep going. Thanks.
Charlotte Rath with Verizon.
One thing, could you also mention if you're new,
Yeah.
if you're new or you've been an
Old?
established member?
See, that's the problem with those words.
Continuing.
History.
Veteran.
Veteran, yeah, that's it.
Paul Endiskevich, CTIA, new.
Dale Hatfield, University of Colorado, very old.
Carolyn Kahn, the MITRE Corporation, I'm new.
Rick Reeser, Raytheon, I am historical.
Tom Dombrowski, DLA Piper, also old.
Brian Tremont, Wilkinson Barker Nauer, original. How about that?
Jennifer Warren, Lockheed Martin, also original.
Andrew Roy from Aviation Spectrum Resources, new.
I'm Mark McHenry with Shared Spectrum Company, and I'm old.
Yes.
Bob Weller with the National Association of Broadcasters. I'm a freshman, and incidentally, I apologize for arriving late, but I was stranded in the elevator in the parking lot below the building, and there's no cell service.
Oh, that's not good.
Throw something at him.
Carl Povolitis, AT&T, old.
Mark Crosby, Enterprise Wireless Alliance. I'm not going to say them all, I'm just not new.
Dennis Roberson from Illinois Institute of Technology and Roberson and Associates, and I have previous experience.
Love it.
Paul Kaladze Consulting, veteran.
Mark Raychek Erickson, old but new here.
Mariam Saran, Dish Network, old.
Mark Llewellyn, John Deere, new.
Kurt Schabach, Federated Wireless. It's good to be back.
Mary Brown, Cisco Systems, new.
Chris Wiesler, Facebook, new.
Steve Sharkey, T-Mobile, also old.
Alan McKenzie, Virginia Tech, new.
Janice Obachowski, FTI, old.
And I'm Larry Alder with Google. And
I'm Mark Gibson, ComSearch, ancient. Okay. Is there anybody on the phone that's a CSMAC member that speak up now?
Yes, hi, this is Audrey Ellison from Boeing. I consider myself a sophomore.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, anybody else on the phone?
Yeah, Michael Calabrese from Open Technology Institute at New America. So I guess if Audrey's a sophomore, I'm a junior. On the block a few times.
Okay, then that should be it for CSMAC members on the phone. Excellent. Okay. I think with that, Larry, I'll turn it over to you to do.
Well, then we wanted to.
Oh, yeah, let's go around the back of the room.
Non-members.
Yeah. Bruce? Oh, okay.
Bruce. Antonio Richardson, NTIA. Bruce Jacobs, NTIA.
William Henry, NTIA.
Random Subramanian, NTIA.
Terry Riddell, Alliance Science and Technology.
Casey Joseph, LS Telcom.
Colin Elkins, FDR.
John Alden.
Garrett Coleman, NTIA.
And I made the unforgivable error of not introducing Paige. So I'm going to pay for that. Sorry about that. Here.
Paige Atkins, NTIA.
Okay, is there anybody we missed other than Paige? All right, good. All right, I think we're ready. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, okay, so I have the next item on the agenda, which is just kind of a kickoff comments. And for a lot of you, I think this will be kind of old news, but I just wanted to kind of go over some of the logistics and how I think we're going to run the CSMAC during this period. So again, welcome to all the new members who are joining us for the first time. I think it's important. David Reed is a key person. David, raise your hand. He is, I don't know how to describe it, kind of our point person for all logistics and administrative. So he's really helped out a lot. So all the new members should take note of David. You'll see a lot of emails from him. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a 2-year term. And the way that we're going to approach it, having discussed with Paige and everyone, is we're going to really break it into 2 1-year cycles. And what we're planning to do is very much in the tradition of the CSMAC, is to a subcommittee-based approach, where we form topic groups by subcommittee. And Paige has challenged us to run a full cycle in a year. So we're going to select the topics, form the subcommittees, do the work, make the recommendations in the first year, and then next year we'll see, maybe do the same thing, but we'll evaluate then. So the idea is to kind of break this 2 years into a 1-year process. So I've kind of laid out some of the schedules. What we're going to do at this meeting is we're going to review the topics. And not to steal too much of Mark's thunder, but what we did for the topics was at the end of last CSMAC session, there was a brainstorming about potential new topics. We collected that information, NTI collected that information, and we met in December and reviewed that. And really driven by NTIA's needs, they came up with these proposed list of topics which we sent around for comment. So the idea today is to discuss those, refine those. You're going to see the headlines on the topics can look familiar. So enforcement has been around, for a while. The idea is we're going to try and narrow it down into a specific focus question. We're not going to take on the whole topic of enforcement, hopefully. We're going to nail it down into, and I think one of the proposed topics is, automation. So that will be part of the discussion today. We'll go through. Hopefully we will leave this discussion with some good ideas on what we want to do. Post the meeting, we will, the co-chairs, Mark and myself, will work with the NTIA to narrow it down into the subcommittees. We hope to do that in the next few weeks, announce the subcommittees, and then during the month of February have the membership select which subcommittees they would like to spend their time on and join. So kind of our schedule is by the end of February to have the subcommittees set up, have people know what subcommittees they are, and have them start meeting in March. And then by April, at our next meeting, those subcommittees can come back. Usually what happens is there's refining of the question, there's that kind of discussion, and then we want to go right into our third meeting, having some preliminary output from the subcommittees, and then our fourth meeting of the year to have final recommendations. So that's the schedule we have in mind. It's admittedly challenging. One of the lessons learned that we're trying to bring forward, and we'll see if we're successful, is that last time we continually think we have too many subcommittees, and it's stretching people too thin. So we're targeting approximately 4. I'm actually targeting 4, but I'm skeptical that we'll end up with 4. It always seems to expand because there's always creative ideas and questions that need to be answered. But we're going to try and keep it a roughly 4. We want very broad participation. Everyone should sign up for at least one subcommittee. Sign up for as many you want, being realistic. But we definitely want to have broad participation. And each of the subcommittees will have co-chairs that will be driving them. So that's the schedule. Again, ultimately, we'll have a discussion today, but ultimately the NTIA will kind of propose the questions. That's their role here, is to propose the questions. So this is the opportunity for input today, but they will do that. I think that's about it for the kickoff. For the new folks here, we have a kind of a tradition for questions. We raise the tents and go around the room, and that indicates that there's questions. We keep it kind of formal. We use the mics so that the recordings can be done. So I just want to throw it open for questions on kind of the overall structure that we're looking at for this CSMAC that I just covered.
Let me add 2 things. One is, I'll say this again and again, when you ask a question, although your table 10 is raised, please say who you are. If you don't, we'll remind you, but it's always helpful because there is a transcript of this, and a lot of times the people doing the transcript don't know our faces. Probably never do, but anyhow, just say who you are. The other thing is, people had asked before the meeting, what's the cadence like on the subcommittees? That's kind of up to the co-chairs of the subcommittees. There's a lot of work, and the more subcommittees that you signed up for, the more work you'll be doing. We will not put you on payroll for CSMAC because there is no payroll, so you keep that in mind. So having, I can speak from experience. I agree with Larry. We don't really want any more than 4 subcommittees. Anybody who's on all 4 subcommittees, you probably need to quit your day job. So just keep in mind that, especially for the new people, it's a lot of work at some point because we're going to have a fairly challenging set of questions. So we'll leave it up to the co-chairs to set the meeting cadence. Typically, it's been about once every 2 weeks or so for the subcommittees to meet. And that tends to work out okay. And as Larry said, what we'll be doing in the next full CSMAC meeting is briefing out from the subcommittee work what you all are doing, any early recommendations you may have, anything you're running into. The other thing that we'll have with the subcommittees will be liaisons from NTIA to help. The liaisons have been excellent. That's a very good thing that Paige instigated, or instituted, I should say. Well, instigate too. To help with just connecting back to the overall vision that NTIA has. So once the subcommittees are finalized and announced, we'll have subcommittee liaison. So anyhow, I just wanted to add that.
Questions from the membership. There has to be at least one.
You don't have to put your table tents up for these. I mean.
Everyone understands the general processes that we're going to go through. Okay, with that, then we're going to for the new members, one of the traditions is that Paige at these meetings gives a very informative update on what's going on with the NTA. So we're going to have that, and then she's going to follow that up by comments on the previous CSMAC's recommendation and actions that they're going to take based on those recommendations. So Paige, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Larry, and I want to thank Charla and Verizon again for hosting this meeting in such a wonderful facility. It really is great. And I would like to welcome everybody, particularly the new members who are joining us for the first time. You know, the importance, interest, and visibility of Spectrum continues, and I can't emphasize enough the critical role that CSMAC has played to ensure that we're maintaining a strategic perspective and that we're looking at our challenges and opportunities through a different lens or set of lenses, I might say. Your advice really helps us make better and more informed decisions, and we look forward to working with each of you over the next couple of years. And if you have questions for the new members in terms of how to engage and integrate your perspectives into the process, you can always reach out to the co-chairs, the seasoned individuals around the table, or obviously the NTIA team, to include Dave Reed, who is officially our designated federal officer, DFO. So you'll hear that term in the future. And I know that being part of a federal advisory committee is not a glamorous job. It's a personal commitment that each of you make to provide your time and your expertise to help us do a better job. And we sincerely appreciate that commitment. And we look forward to the collective wisdom that you'll be providing to NTIA over the next 2 years. So again, thank you. So today, as Larry and Mark talked about, we'll look at some of the actions that NTIA has identified based on the last set of recommendations that we received at the end of the last cycle. And then we will kick off the dialogue on the new topics so we can set those for this next year, as Larry mentioned in terms of the schedule. And as we start the latter discussion in terms of trying to limit to 4 subcommittees, I also want to remind folks to remain focused and try to prevent scope creep in those subcommittees and around the topics and questions that we identify, and to focus on practical and actionable recommendations that NTIA can take hold of and execute for those recommendations that we accept. So again, please remain focused. And before we get into the meat of the discussion, I'd like to give you an update. As Larry indicated earlier, it is something that we traditionally do at each meeting. And the intent is really to provide additional context for all of the members and update you on ongoing activities, accomplishments, and hopefully you'll find it useful. I welcome any feedback in terms of the content and other items that you might feel are useful as you go through the deliberations for the topics at hand. So to recap, it's a new year, new term for CSMAC, as we have said, and perhaps a time to take stock of where we are, how far we've come, and how we're going to move forward in the future. Looking broadly at the recent achievements in the Spectrum community, we have made great strides and have seen really tremendous progress. And in fact, as I was writing these notes, it was amazing to me how much has been done since the last meeting. So they'll be a little lengthier than normal, just to warn you all. We have strengthened our collaborative processes to identify sharing opportunities, to thoroughly analyze those opportunities, and where possible, to take advantage of them to make Spectrum newly available for broadband and other commercial services. A prime example that we've talked about includes the collaboration, much of which was led by CSMAC, that contributed to the tremendous success of AWS-3, and now that's in the full throes of transition. And our success during the transition, as it was in the planning stage, is really contingent on 2 critical elements: the industry-government collaboration, as well as spectrum sharing. And those two elements continue to escalate in importance across all of the spectrum activities that we're involved in. We can always point to the hard work that resulted in the innovative sharing and licensing approach in 3.5 gigahertz, which maximizes the use of the band by federal and commercial incumbents, as well as different classes of new users. Despite a complex framework, government and industry stakeholders are making great strides as they work hard to put this valuable mid-band spectrum to use to increase capacity of wireless broadband services. And this framework will be enabled by spectrum access systems and environmental sensing technologies, and that will make it possible to have an increasingly dynamic spectrum sharing environment. And a key event that took place in December, the FCC conditionally approved 7 SAS administrator applications, paving the way for future compliance testing and operations. In addition, we continued to examine whether we can meet industry's requests for expanded unlicensed access to 5 gigahertz for Wi-Fi and other uses. For the 5350 to 5475 megahertz band, we had to evaluate whether unlicensed devices could operate without degrading the performance of critical federal radar systems. And unfortunately, the methodical analysis we conducted in collaboration with the agencies, the federal agencies, the FCC, and industry led us to conclude that there is no feasible path forward to share this band. And those who had been engaged in the effort were not surprised, as all of the stakeholders on all sides knew that we had high hurdles to overcome, but we wanted to exhaust all of the options to see if it would be feasible. And though that this may be a setback in terms of this particular band, it shows our process is rigorous and it works. It is fundamental that all stakeholders have trust and confidence that we will run a fair and objective process. And over the long run, we believe this process will truly allow us to make more spectrum available for commercial access. At the same time, we continue to work collaboratively with FCC, Department of Transportation, and industry to evaluate and test potential approaches to sharing the upper 5 gigahertz band, 5850 to 5920 megahertz, between vehicle-to-vehicle safety communications and unlicensed uses such as Wi-Fi. And this process continues. We also remain committed to identifying additional spectrum for unlicensed use, and will work with the FCC to explore other bands as we move forward. And just within the past week, and I won't talk any details, but the FCC announced it reached the final stage rule in its incentive auction of UHF spectrum. As a result, an additional 84 megahertz of low-band spectrum will be made available for licensed and unlicensed use. And this will mean that we have made 329 megahertz of federal and non-federal spectrum available for wireless broadband since 2010. Now, we are all digesting the results of the incentive auction, a truly novel market-based means of repurposing spectrum. But one thing we should be able to acknowledge is that advances in technology and continuously evolving business models means that our assumptions about spectrum become outdated over time. For example, the commercial mobile industry for a number of years was calling for significantly more access to spectrum in the lower bands below 3 gigahertz. This beachfront spectrum was desirable due to its ability to travel long distances, penetrate buildings. However, mobile networks are evolving to support very high bandwidth, high volume applications, placing greater emphasis on higher band spectrum, which can provide the bandwidth required to achieve that capacity. In other words, spectrum demand is not a one-size-fits-all in terms of bands and even in the commercial mobile wireless market. So to help address the need for greater capacity, we continue to collaborate with the FCC, agencies, and industry on making spectrum available for 5G services, particularly in the millimeter wave bands. The FCC Spectrum Frontiers Report and Order and further notice clearly gave the United States a jump start in determining which bands are most appropriate for 5G. We now have parallel processes in which to engage. In addition to the FCC's proceeding, the ITU is studying a set of bands as part of its preparation for the 2019 World Radio Communication Conference, or WARC. And preparations for WARC 19, and many of you are engaged in that process, are well underway. And the U.S. has focused its efforts on 4 priority agenda items. And as everyone would expect, one of those is terrestrial mobile broadband, and in particular above 24 gigahertz. The FCC further notice for Spectrum Frontiers covers much of the same spectrum, so it will be important to try to harmonize our domestic and international work. And other priorities for those not engaged include high-altitude platform systems, 5 gigahertz wireless access systems, and aeronautical safety systems. And we've begun to develop U.S. positions for the conference and have made progress on socializing our initial views, including those on terrestrial mobile broadband. And that occurred in the second CTEL Americas Regional Meeting in late November. So again, a lot of activity. And we will continue to work closely with the FCC, industry, and federal agencies to continue the leadership the U.S. shows in these regional activities. As we continued to make progress in many areas, it was clear to us that we needed to be more transparent by improving the availability and quality of data about federal and non-federal use. As an example, in November, we released a report on the quantitative assessments of spectrum usage, which examined 5 bands used by federal agencies, totaling 960 megahertz of spectrum, to determine which ones might be good candidates for potential sharing scenarios. We now have an automated internal capability that allows us to more effectively and graphically understand federal spectrum usage. And when I say that, think of frequency, time of use, and geography, also translated to population within the U.S., and potential opportunities for sharing. As an example, though 1300 to 1350 megahertz was clearly not conducive to sharing due to the systems that populate that band, particularly the long-range surveillance system, this tool demonstrated that relocating the long-range surveillance radars out of the band created significant opportunities for commercial access in terms of geography and population. We will be extending the quantitative assessment methodology to other bands over time and leveraging this information to assess and prioritize bands for detailed studies that will be necessary before being able to recommend a band for repurposing. Over the years, there has been much discussion about creating incentives for federal agencies to make more spectrum available for commercial use. And we strongly believe the most effective incentive is to provide agencies with the necessary resources to research alternatives to their existing uses of spectrum and to upgrade to more efficient technologies. A key tool in this regard is the Spectrum Relocation Fund, the spectrum auction proceeds. And Congress made an important and needed change to the fund as part of the 2015 Spectrum Pipeline Act to broaden the scope of eligible expenses covered under the SRF. These efforts are starting to bear fruit as federal agencies have developed spectrum pipeline plans for submission to a technical panel, which consists of NTIA, FCC, and OMB for approval. And last week, the first of such plans, called the Spectrum Efficient National Surveillance Radar, or SENSOR, a pipeline plan, was approved and transmitted to Congress, and there's a 60-day congressional notification before the funds will flow. And in that plan, the FAA, in partnership with the DoD, DHS, and NOAA, will be assessing the possibility of consolidating and relocating various radar capabilities, which may result in making a portion of the 1300 to 1350 megahertz band available for commercial access. And this is a major component to creating a sustainable pipeline to satisfy emerging and growing requirements. So it's just a tremendous feat, and we look forward to the fruits that it will bear. I could actually go into more examples since the last meeting, but I'm not going to because we'll never get to discussing future topics. But I do want to look forward a little bit. There's still a lot to do. And as we talk about future topics, I want to tee up a few additional points for consideration. We are just starting to explore the spectrum policy implications of the emergence of new technologies such as unmanned aircraft systems, connected cars, and the vast array of IoT connected devices. And we recognize the need for low, mid, and high band spectrum to satisfy these diverse requirements. As we prepare for the innovations of 5G and other emerging technologies and applications, we need to understand the growth in the demand for spectrum is not limited to commercial and consumer use. Just as innovations and technology have driven growth in the commercial wireless market, government agencies are finding new and better ways to more effectively deliver on their critical missions. And I can't emphasize enough when we talk about their critical missions, think of ensuring safety for you and your family each and every day. I ask you to remember in your deliberations throughout the next 2 years that we must have balanced spectrum policy that enables innovation and growth in emerging wireless commercial services while ensuring the agencies have the spectrum they need to serve the public as their missions require. So keep in mind balance. So let me briefly just mention a few other issues that I believe will remain front and center, and many of which are related to the future topics. Spectrum sharing. There really is no longer any question that it has to be part of the solution and a major part. And the only way sharing will work is by maintaining and extending collaborative and cooperative processes and relationships that bring all affected stakeholders together. And I can't emphasize enough, CSMAC is a critical component to making that happen. Enforcement. As the airwaves become more congested, we need to develop and enforce minimal technical rules to protect against unauthorized, harmful interference. Automated enforcement approaches make a lot of sense, but it will require increased investment to develop techniques, technologies, and tools. And we need to look for opportunities to build enforcement technology into emerging capabilities such as 5G and IoT. And to clarify, when I say enforcement, I think of it in a broad context to include mitigating interference before it occurs, not just ex post. And we always need to address the performance characteristics of spectrum receivers as well. Think resilience of receivers. And I do believe that it's the only way to truly optimize spectrum usage by looking at both sides of the equation. Research and development. We must continue to invest in research and development of technologies that will help us make the most effective and efficient use of the spectrum. While we believe agencies are making good faith efforts to meet our spectrum challenges, we know there's still more that we can do to make us even more efficient and effective. Again, the additional flexibility that Congress authorized for the SRF was probably the single most important step that could be taken in the short term. Perhaps the fund can be further strengthened in the future, and the CSMAC did some work on this previously with additional funding and flexibility, for example, by supporting research into allowing more unlicensed use in federal bands. Incentives. We've touched on incentives. We are not convinced that other incentive proposals put forward to date offer approaches that are likely to be successful, especially those that rely only on market-based incentives. Federal agencies are simply unable to respond to market-based incentives in the same way that commercial spectrum users are able to for various reasons, including budgetary and statutory constraints. And we are continuing at NTIA to explore potential mechanisms that might be effective. And ultimately, we hope to make enough progress that we can bring concepts forward and begin a dialogue with the agencies and other stakeholders. And this dialogue should also include potential incentives for commercial industry licensees to share spectrum with federal users. Finally, we also need to more accurately quantify current spectrum demand, usage, and future projections for both federal and non-federal users. Technologies and business models change rapidly, and to ensure we keep up with these changes, we need to focus on actual needs, including things like coverage, capacity, latency, and resiliency and reliability. This type of information will greatly inform us as we make future spectrum policy decisions. So summing up, with that, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on potential topics for this upcoming term. I know challenges and hard work lie ahead, but I am very confident that you will succeed, and I'm looking forward to working with each and every one of you and collectively as the committee. So thank you once again for volunteering your time and expertise to help us. It's an important service to NTIA, Department of Commerce, and our nation. And so good luck, and let's get rolling. And any questions?
Jennifer.
Jennifer Warren, Lockheed Martin. Paige, you mentioned the report that went to Congress on 1300 to 1350, and I think you said there's a 60-day review by Congress of that. Is the report that went up public, or does that not become public until after congressional review? Do you know?
I do not believe it is public at this time. However, there is quite a lot of information, I'll say, out there, including some at least summary information through some work the FAA has done, including, I believe, 1 or 2 industry days. So there is quite a bit of information out there.
Try to go to the original source. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
Same question on the 5350. You said you kind of wrapped that up. Is there some place that's encapsulated in your analysis?
In terms of like a report specifically, we have not generated a formal report because it's fairly recent. We just wrapped that up within the last few weeks. So we'll have to think about how to encapsulate that more formally. But there's a lot of information behind it, including through the joint government industry working group that occurred.
That'd be great to get some.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, I have a question. Mark Gibson. You mentioned a tool that you use to do the quantitative analysis, actually. Your report also referred to a tool you were working on to actually do coverage analysis, interference analysis. First of all, am I right? And secondly, what's the status of that?
I'm not sure exactly because I'm not sure of what you're referencing, but I'll say for the quantitative assessment, there was one tool that allowed us to capture information on federal systems with certain assumptions around what it might affect around it. And that tool generates, I'll say, contours that allow us to depict what areas of geography or population may be impacted by federal systems. We are looking at if there is a potential to generate a publicly facing similar tool, but ensuring that sensitive information is not exposed. So we are looking at that as well.
Okay, good. Thanks. Any other questions, Rick?
Yeah, this is Rick Reese. You answered my question. I was wondering if I've read the report too that came out in November, and I was curious if the tool itself was going to be available, or at least the methodology of the tool. The report basically talks about the results of the analysis and there's some appendices about it, but didn't really explain how you came up with that. There wasn't like whatever. So you sound like you might come up with a publicly available version of the tool or something we can look at later.
We're still assessing the possibility to do that, and I thought some of the methodology was in the report, but I could be wrong.
In a cursory way.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thanks, Paige, for that. That's always really exciting to hear what you're working on and what's been successful. Did you want to now go into the reviews on the subcommittee recommendations? Okay.
Yeah. We might as well get that out of the way as we get into the meat of the discussion.
Yeah, all that time.
No, I mean, it's important. And I do want to stress one reason, and I started this after the last cycle, one reason I want to give you an idea of how we're reacting to your recommendations is to show that we are taking your recommendations seriously. We may not always accept them. In some cases, the recommendations may not really be recommendations or actionable recommendations, and we continue to work on that. But we do take the information, understand it, determine if we think it would be useful, as well as how it aligns with our ongoing activities and strategic initiatives, which is very important. So what I'm going to do today, and we've got some slides in front of us, and I'm going to go to slide 2. What I'm going to cover is how we're responding or some specific actions we've identified based on the recommendations that were given and approved in August of 2016. And again, not all the actions or recommendations were actionable to address. Many of the actions that we're taking related to the recommendations are ongoing, so you won't see everything here. It's not an all-inclusive list. And as a caveat, all of these actions are subject to change based on priorities and funding availability. And again, what I'll be talking about are discrete actions, and so they may seem a little disconnected or in isolation of one another, but we are integrating these activities into our strategic approach forward. So it will be a little more comprehensive as we integrate it into our mainstream workflow. So on slide 3 with measurement and sensing, and I apologize for the new members that weren't part of the old activities, so I'll try to give you a little bit of context for each of these before I talk about the actions that we'll be responding with. So in measurement and sensing, we were asking the CSMAC to help us understand the strengths and weaknesses of measurement and sensing to enable sharing, and in particular a focus on 5 gigahertz with all the work going on in 5 gigahertz and helping us ensure we weren't missing something that could enable sharing in particularly the 2 5 gigahertz bands that have been under study. And the team did a lot of great work to include characterizing the 5 gigahertz bands in terms of the systems that were in there and architectural approaches that you might use to optimize the ability to measure and sense those systems. And we want to build on that information and that baseline. So on the first action that we're taking, we're going to develop a handbook of best practices for performing measurements. And again, this will build on the approach that was provided by the subcommittee or the committee recommendation and work. And we will initially focus on 5 gigahertz, but then extend it over time. And we think this will be a very powerful tool. You'll see that the timelines are extended, and that's based on, again, priorities and resources. So they could get compressed or could get elongated or could get canceled for that matter. But we think this is an important reference that will allow not only NTIA to do better, but the community at large, because we'll have some reference point. We will be leveraging our ITS lab to do this work. On the second item, if you recall, the subcommittee also generated this characterization of what systems were in the 5 gigahertz band. And we have a spectrum compendium that does something similar, but it only went up to 5. And so we're going to be extending that up to 7 gigahertz initially, and then looking beyond that in the future to include millimeter wave bands. And so this will help extend that characterization of what systems are in there. And then on the third item, we are going to generate a white paper to identify the opportunities and barriers for techniques such as beaconing that augment detectability of federal systems. In many cases, as many of you know, it won't be necessarily applicable or prudent depending on security issues, but we want to just encapsulate that and document it. And in some cases, it may be applicable. So we want to make sure that we capture kind of a best practices and lessons learned in that case. And again, we're going to initially focus in some of the 5 gigahertz systems and then extend below 7 gigahertz and look at prioritizing which bands make sense or which systems make sense in the future. So we're, again, taking these recommendations to heart, and we appreciate the good work that the committee did in the last cycle. Any questions on that one before I go on?
Brian, then Rick.
I would just urge on the third bullet that the 3.5 stuff is relatively nascent still. The longest term example is a non-federal one, but the white spaces lessons learned,
Right.
where I think there's quite a bit. There's more data and more time. So I would just urge people to look at that as well.
Yeah, and I think also with the 3.5, some of the lessons learned are in the discussions in terms of operational security concerns and things of that nature as well.
Rick.
This is Rick Reeser, Raytheon. I just 2 things. I really am encouraged that you're looking at the beacon thing because that's something I think is very important. My other point was on number 2. I think what you ought to have is a plan to take this 7 gigahertz all the way up to 100 gigahertz over time. That would be very, very helpful. So don't stop at 7. You set some targets and go all the way up to actually 275 gigahertz would also be helpful too. So
well, one reason we chose 7 is because that was in the recommendation.
Were you on that committee,
And as I did mention, then we will continue to extend it to include potentially the next priority, looking at some of the millimeter wave bands, and then we're going to continue to improve and extend it.
So I need to have a comeback to that. The reason why we said 7 was because we were asked to look at just above 5, and so Ed Drusella had to go through heroic efforts to give us information about just between 5 and 6. So we said 7. So that was the reason for 7.
But we agree, and I don't know if folks have actually looked at the compendium and we've got it on our website. It's actually quite helpful. And so I encourage you to look at it, and we will ensure that you're aware of updates that we provide, either in terms of enhanced functionality or as we extend the bands as well.
I'd like to just add a comment to what Brian said. This is Mark Gibson. With respect to the 3.5 gig band, Brian's right, it is nascent, but as you well know, there's a lot of activity in that band. And I know you will be speaking within agencies. It would be really helpful to include the community as well, because there are a lot of lessons learned going back and forth, and I know Kurt and I and others are sharing in the middle of that. So to the extent that you could reach out as well to us, because that is really changing actually almost as we speak, you'll get a lot of good feedback, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And as you know, there's a lot of joint activity, so we'll be drawing off of that.
Mark Raycheck Erickson. Also, there will be some opportunity to talk to the SAS administrators and ESC administrators as well. As they gain experience, they ought to be able to go ahead and discuss that experience with NTI, because they'll have very useful information.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, next one, 5G, slide number 4. And this was our first foray, I'll say, into 5G. And we asked the committee to look at the technical and standardization challenges unique to 5G and what actions NTIA should take to address those challenges. And we expect that this will be an area of continued focus for the committee this next cycle. And we identified 2 particular actions that we want to take. And there were multiple recommendations that really roll up into the first action, where we had recommendations related to what to ensure we address in terms of use cases and other things like bandwidth and duplexing, et cetera, the characteristics of 5G. And so what we want to do, since there's a lot of ongoing work in this area, both domestically and internationally, is that we want to create an overall, I'll call it actually a work plan, to ensure that the components of the recommendations are folded into our activities domestically and internationally, as well as the standards engagement that will occur, and I'll get a little more into the standards work here in a moment. But part of this effort will help us in terms of coordination and ensuring we're not missing anything, and it should help the folks that we're working with, the other stakeholders, to ensure that we're addressing all of the key items of interest in these other activities to ensure 5G is successful as we move forward. And in particular, with a focus also in characteristics around sharing that enable sharing. And that rolls into the second action. There is a lot of interest in how can we do better collectively in engaging and influencing the standards, particularly as it relates to enabling sharing and in 5G specifically. So we have started to participate in 3GPP, and we want to collaborate with the Commission, the agencies, and industry to develop a strategy around how do we best engage in 3GPP or other standards activities in order to integrate key spectrum sharing elements that could enable sharing between federal and non-federal users in these bands. So those are the two actions that we have on the docket based on the last set of recommendations. Any questions on that one?
Miriam. I'd be disappointed if you didn't ask a question.
Yeah, well, I don't know. This is Mariam Saran with Dish Network. So I just had a question, and thank you for considering the recommendations that the subcommittee made. The overall plan that the NTIA is developing in conjunction with what, as I was looking, and I'm not trying to jump ahead, but the future work for 5G, is that something that CSMAC will be sort of involved in, or do you see that plan as being jointly developed by CSMAC, or is this something the NTIA is actually going to be doing themselves, independent of that CSMAC work, which may be sort of the next steps of things?
Yeah, so I see, one, we will be integrating some of the specifics of the last report that was generated by the CSMAC. We wouldn't be doing this totally independently because that wouldn't make sense. So we will engage not necessarily the CSMAC in the near-term effort because the cycle is just, we want to get it done more quickly than would allow by engagement with CSMAC formally. But we will be engaging, again, industry and the commission, and then we will continue, we'll have a liaison with whatever 5G efforts might occur in the next cycle. And this will be an iterative process. This won't be a static document because things will be changing in terms of priorities, activities, et cetera. So we will imagine that the next cycle of CSMAC will continue to feed into our work plan, our engagement strategy for standards, et cetera. Okay, the next item, government-industry collaboration. And I think we've exhausted this topic, but we did want to wrap up on a couple of things. We had, I'll say, a general question on should there be regulatory changes to better leverage collaboration between industry and government for sharing, to include things like operator-to-operator type coordination. The focus of the subcommittee, well, the answer was basically there's really not anything to do in terms of changes, and the focus was on the topic of sharing of sensitive and or classified information, which has come up multiple times over the years. So what we want to do, just to wrap this up and set the stage for further discussion as it comes up in other forums, not in CSMAC, we are going to generate a white paper that helps encapsulate what the situation is, because some of the discussion has not been feasible in terms of approaches. So we want to make sure we have documented what is feasible, what isn't, to set a common baseline for any future discussions. And if opportunities come up to reassess certain approaches, we can certainly do that. But we want to make sure everybody has a common baseline so we don't churn on this issue too much in the future. We also do want to take a look at the benefits and limitations of having a classified component to CSMAC. There are other advisory committees that do classified work. As I've expressed in the past and during the debates over the last year, my concern are things like that would limit membership, it would limit transparency of what comes, potentially transparency of what comes out of the committee, which I'm not sure we want to do in the activities that we're pursuing. But we're going to look at it and better understand and document the pros and cons. I would doubt we'll add a classified component for the reasons that I indicated, but we do want to take a look at it. Any questions on that?
I was going to say,
I was looking at you, Tom,
Yeah,
Steve.
Tom Dombrowski. I think one thing that would be helpful is to not limit it to just looking at a classified component to CSMAC, but broadly, because a lot of the conversations that we've been having outside of CSMAC also would benefit from having a classified component potentially as well. So
Yeah, I think
if we
that
can look at it broadly would be helpful.
I think that goes back to the first action, is to ensure that everyone understands the framework.
Yeah, I understand that part, but I'm just saying, for example, if we have a particular federal agency that has a spectrum band, they could potentially partner up or sponsor people for clearances, for discussions with that agency about that particular thing.
Right.
So,
And
I think
some
the
of those
first paper goes to
methods-
that, and I don't think it has to be limited to
Yeah.
CSMAC, would be helpful.
So those kinds of methods and what you could or could not do would be defined in that first output.
Right.
So you understand, better understand in those external activities what you might be able to do contractually or otherwise to facilitate that discussion and sponsorship. Okay. Okay.
You did
Okay.
see?
Okay. We think that will help everybody, and then we can get into discussions and answer questions.
Is this one white paper with just these two topics?
It might be two.
Okay.
We'll see whether it warrants two or not.
Thank you.
Okay.
See that recommendation's coming forward from the subcommittee.
Okay.
That died the death of 1,000 cuts.
Okay, the next one, federal non-federal sharing, which is another one that we've had a lot of activity in CSMAC. And in this case, we were focused on how to enable shared access, federal access to non-federal spectrum, and in different conditions, intermittent to long-term and more pervasive access, as well as there was a component about incentives, going back to a comment I made earlier, incentives for licensees, exclusive licensees to share with federal entities. And there was a lot of good work done. There was a lot of interchange on public safety kinds of examples that have occurred and exist today in terms of federal, non-federal sharing. And what we want to do initially is be able to capture the I'll say best practices and activities in what we're calling a reference document for sharing this first item, to include the approaches, current examples, and again, public safety is a good one, and lessons learned. And in conjunction with that, the second bullet is we want to create a repository of information that includes that document as well as perhaps other documents to include not only practical things we're doing today, but theoretical things that may look promising, and perhaps some sample MOUs that are out there that enable sharing between federal and non-federal entities. But we have to look at the feasibility, particularly including some of the MOUs, or perhaps identifying some templates that people can use as a best practice. So we want to encapsulate document and put it in a repository initially for our own use, but potentially then for more publicly accessible use in the future. And then the third bullet, we want to explore the challenges and opportunities of federal agencies and non-federal entities to enhance their access to either each other's spectrum or each other's, I'll say, infrastructure, networks, facilities. There was a recommendation tied to should each other have direct access and authorization to use the frequencies. So you might think one example may be dual licensing or authorizations, which does occur on occasion today. Other examples may be actually sharing infrastructure as an example. So we're going to look at that and peel it back and understand what that may look like, pros and cons, what is the, I'll call it the art of the possible. And then the last item is to conduct a workshop. And this is to pull the stakeholders together and to peel back and better understand the use cases in terms of federal access to non-federal spectrum. What kind of applications, what are the challenges in federal entities needing access? What does that look like around installations or more pervasive access? And then talk about barriers to sharing and potential solutions. So we'd like to try to have a workshop toward the end of this fiscal year. So that's a tentative date. And you'll see each of these have a quarter and year associated with them, which are I'll say, notional or target dates as we see them today. And then that will feed, obviously, future work, whether it be from NTIA's perspective or perhaps feeding into the next year cycle, after this one ends. Any questions?
I have a comment. Just for people's benefit who were on the last CSMAC, this was the federal versus non-federal. The federal non-federal sharing was a topic that came up in our brainstorming, and the meeting we had was kind of decided that we had done a lot of work and it would be good to take some of these actions and then maybe come back to it. So it was intentionally left off. It was consciously left off the list for this year, the proposed list.
And that was similar to what we did with enforcement. We had a great cycle and great report on enforcement, and NTIA took some actions to work in that area, and you heard about some of them that Glenn mentioned earlier. And then we are hoping that it might be a topic for focus in this next cycle.
And I was glad to see that, one of the questions I think that to fuel a more productive next session on CSMAC was this use cases. So it's good. I'm glad to see that workshop.
Yeah, and we had some use cases that were discussed during the last cycle, but I think it's to get a more robust understanding of what that actually looks like. And so we'll make sure that the CSMAC is informed as we move toward that workshop. And the last item is slide number 7, the Spectrum Access System, Spectrum Database, International Extension. And this was, how do we understand and address the challenges of extending our domestic solutions to sharing to the international environment, particularly in terms of access databases and things that get much harder from a security standpoint and an implementation standpoint when you look at international deployment. And so we got a lot of good information, as we did with the other subcommittees and committee, on this topic. And what we want to do is take a step back to a certain degree and try to define our priorities and challenges to successful sharing approaches internationally and develop a strategy. So we will look at things like SaaS implementations, better define the opportunities or the best way to or the best bands, I'll say, that could potentially implement that kind of technology or other sharing technology, the likelihood of wanting to share from a global standpoint and help us prioritize the areas and better define the risks and challenges with those kinds of implementations, so we can start peeling it back in terms of addressing the security challenges or other challenges that we identify. We also want to, in the second item, you always have a challenge of how do you characterize systems for sharing, and particularly for national security systems. There's always this balance of how do you provide enough information to enable sharing while protecting sensitive and classified information on the system itself, whether it be looking at database implementations or even sensing implementations as examples. So we want to look at options in terms of how do we better characterize waveforms, how do we better envelope the waveforms that enable sharing, but again, protect the information that's behind it. So we're going to peel that back to another level as well. And then there was I'll say perception that NTIA really didn't, I'll be blunt, didn't really know what was going on from an R&D perspective. And in fact, there are a lot of activities going on that we participate in, but we want to better understand what is going on in spectrum sharing R&D, in particular where we are engaged, where the gaps are, and determine where we need to create more robust engagement from an NTIA perspective. Not just engagement in those forums, but then dissemination of that information back out to the agencies as well, to enhance our collaboration and coordination. So we will be looking at that to create internal recommendations of where we should potentially apply additional resources. Any questions on that?
I had a question on number 2. So the ESC providers in 3.5 gig band are working with ITS. I believe MITRE had a role in that as well as others. They were doing measurements of radar waveforms, non-specific radar waveforms. Is that part of what you're talking about, or is it in addition to that, or?
I would say I believe that will inform. I'm not sure it's all-inclusive.
Okay. Because they have an action actually to provide additional waveform data from another measurement location. And so to the extent that you could try to be, I know it's the end of the year, annual year this year, but if you could become part of that and facilitate that, that'd be a great help.
And I believe our folks are already engaged with ITS on that.
Right, good.
And some of the lessons learned we'll be applying are out of the 3.5 activities.
Janice.
Just a couple observations. One going backwards, because I didn't get my 10 up quickly enough. On the 2 preceding topics, government-industry collaboration. We have Dennis Roberson here, which is, of course, a resource. But in general, the TAC and the CSMAC work along parallel courses and have both done work. And I guess this sort of comes forward as a suggestion from me, perhaps, that perhaps once a year we have a joint meeting, or perhaps we schedule on a semi-annual basis briefings in 2 different directions. Because increasingly in the world of sharing, issues are going to come up, and it would be good to kind of cross-pollinate. And I guess in the area of cross-pollination and taking us down a even broader path, the topic of cyber interconnects with this database topic in kind of frightening ways. It's front of mind nationally, and it came up particularly in the case of international expansion of database technology. But just as a general topic, I think it's perhaps been underappreciated as a threat. And I would be specifically interested in our advisory committee having that as an agenda item at a minimum to be briefed, perhaps invite in the new administration, some responsible player, to talk about the topic of cyber and how it might impact this spectrum environment, particularly the federal spectrum environment.
Yeah, and I think from a database standpoint, when we talk about security, it has multiple facets to including cyber. And I will say, as you look across enhancing sharing, dynamic sharing, and other related technologies, tools, and techniques, it intersects with not just cyber, but also privacy. And so there are multiple interdependent pieces that we may want to think about how to better address and or identify, so we can look at actions to address those in a collective manner. And we can draw on some of the other activities within NTIA in that regard.
Well, I think to me it becomes crucial, because if I have an observation to make historically, as somebody who is a convert to great appreciation for sharing, the philosophy outstrips the implementation, even to date. And inviting those folks into the dialogue, I think, puts a certain amount of pressure on us and on the policy process. It forces the solutions faster than they're coming forward.
I will also go back quickly to the TAC CSMAC interaction. So, as you know, last year we had a designated NTIA liaison into the TAC and vice versa. And we've talked about at times not just information exchange, but also leveraging folks that serve in both capacities that are here today to think about identifying topics perhaps that we may want to discuss pursuing jointly in some capacity. So I would offer that for thought, and particularly for folks like Dennis and Dale, et cetera, to, if there's some particular item that you think we need to consider in that regard, please highlight it as we go along.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else?
Nope, I'm done.
Well, hour, so good for you. Thank you. Okay, Larry's asking if people want to take, we're ahead of schedule.
We're ahead of schedule.
Yeah, by about 13 minutes. By exactly 13 minutes, you want to look at the clock up there. So do people want to take a leg stretch break and come back at 2:30 did we start back on the nose at 2:30, which is what this agenda says? So we'll start whether you're here or not at 2:30. Okay, then let's break for 12 minutes now.
All right, I think we're going to get started right here at 2:30. Thanks, everyone, for being prompt. So the next section of the agenda is the more participatory section. We're going to walk through a discussion of the potential topics. Again, just a reminder, as we got here, we took the input from the brainstorming session last time, took the input from the past work, worked with Paige and her staff to come up with this list that we circulated to everyone, and I hope everyone had a chance to review it. We did solicit comments. We'll try and summarize those comments that we got on each of the topics. We didn't get too many comments, which was either people weren't paying attention and were busy, or it meant we were generally in the right direction. We'll find out as the discussion ensues today. So I think there's two key points. We are going to ultimately narrow it down to 4 subcommittees. We might not do that here today. Today might just be collecting input and discussion. But as important is each topic focusing it down, figuring out what is really the point of focus where the CSMAC can add the most value. Again, I think an example is enforcement. We don't want to take on the generic topic of enforcement, but maybe a specific question in there. And again, the discussion is really the upfront opportunity for everyone to shape what we're doing. We're going to live with this outcome for the next year as we work in these subcommittees. So it's a good opportunity up front to get input on the questions. But ultimately, it will be the NTIA that does kind of propose the questions. So everyone, there should be a copy of the slides here, if everyone's picked that up at the desk, and we're just gonna walk through them kind of one topic at a time. I think I'm gonna cover the first slide, and then Mark's gonna walk us through each one together. So we had 6 topic areas that were identified. Again, the broad topics isn't representative of the actual focus. 5G was the first one. International reconciliation of the U.S. policy with international policy. And I think there's some clarification there. I saw in some of the comments there's some discussion that needs to happen there. Enforcement, and again, a specific action. The process for identifying suitable bans, the CSMAC. I mean, the NTIA already has a process, and they'd like input on how to refine that process. And the 5th topic is around the pipeline of spectrum professionals and some concerns that the NTIA has in that area. And the 6th one, we used the word incentives, but it's really not all about incentives. It's about some of these things like the Spectrum Fund, how do you fund spectrum research, and so forth. So those are the 6 areas. Again, the goal is to have 3 or 4 topics. And we've outlined again the timeline that we're shooting for, roughly forming these committees in February, next having them start meeting in March, next meeting, the first kind of round of discussion, 3rd meeting preliminary, 4th meeting final. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to walk us through some of the first topic.
Okay, well, I'm not going to read this. I assume all of us in the room are literate, and so, myself included. But basically, what we're looking for is to pick up the work and the 5G work that was done before, and see how we can focus on things like spectrum sharing technologies that are inherent in 5G that might be helpful for sharing in the context of 5G. What the work was done before, which I'll say again was excellent work, was characterizing 5G in the context of the federal commercial sharing. What we're looking for now in this is to take a look more at 5G and find out what, in terms of waveforms or aspects of the standard, that would facilitate sharing. That's kind of the context for this. So the first thing is, looking at receiver performance, particularly with respect to IoT devices. The second is 5G technologies that might facilitate interference prevention, detection, and resolution. And you might find some of this overlaps perhaps into the enforcement. We're not going there specifically with this, but if you see things like that, feel free to tell the enforcement committee. And then the standards challenges. Now, as Paige said, NTI has been participating in 3GPP, but if there's any standards challenges that you can identify up front that we can begin to get into study items within 3GPP, that would be helpful. So let me stop and see with that one. There's another question in respect to 37 to 40 gig we'll get to in a second. Let's have some conversation around that and see what people think.
Before we do that, I wanted to...
Oh, yeah.
What we're going to do is, we did receive emails. Some of them were sent to the whole group. Some of them were sent just to us. So just summarizing the email comments that we received before we kick it open for the general discussion. Basically, all the email comments were, this is generally an area we should be working on. There was general support for this, that it was timely. Dennis was concerned that maybe the standards have already kind of gotten out in front of it, but still felt like it was a good topic. Charlotte had some specific questions about why the 37 to 40 gigahertz was specifically called out. But other than that, everyone seemed supportive on the email chain.
And so the context for the 37 to 40 is, again, that band actually has some potential sharing considerations. And so in the context of 5G, what is going on within 5G that can be exploited to facilitate sharing, assuming sharing is even in the offing for that. So that's generally the outline for the 5G topics. So in light of what Larry read with respect to some of the feedback, thoughts and comments. And by the way, we've got 6 topics to cover in an hour, so I want to try to march it along pretty quickly, but I do want to get, in turn, we get feedback. So thoughts. Jennifer, you look like you're puzzled, so...
Yeah, Miriam.
And Miriam, while you're getting a puzzle, Miriam.
Yep. So Jennifer Warren. So I was pondering because I too was struggling with the second question under 5G, why it would be band specific, but why it wouldn't be 5G and deployment options. How could different deployment options, given that it's a multiple band concept, be looked at? And while we are focused on federal, non-federal, some of those deployment options that come out could be then useful for even non-federal. So I guess I would be interested in a broader discussion of its usefulness
Okay.
in that
Before
context.
Paige responds to that, and I think that's a good comment, I just wanted to, when I was in the room and we were discussing this, the specific band, the 37 to 37.6, is already called out as dynamic sharing. I think that was because for this 5G topic, the focus was sharing. That's why that particular one was called out. I don't, Paige, if you have further comments.
I think it is our, I'll say, nearest target. So that the emphasis was on that band to help us as the further notice goes forward and defines what that sharing might look like. And so thinking through what kinds of use cases, how would we make it work, et cetera. But I agree in the broader context, you know, we want to be able to extend it across the
Or
different
extrapolate
bands.
it, yeah.
If appropriate.
Yeah. Thank you.
And actually, I just have a follow-on on that. So am I understanding that really what you're talking about is 37 to 37.6 and not the whole band? Because that actually is, you know, particularly with what's coming up on the NPRM, but 37 to 37.6 was very specifically something that was addressed in the order. So, and I knew that that was something that you wanted to do. So it just confused me a little bit it almost seemed like you were broadening it only to that band.
I think the idea was, how do we focus it in a way that makes sense to get solid recommendations out of it in a year time frame, and what is the priority? So even if you go beyond 37 to 37.6, there are some other federal systems, so the sharing to me would be easier probably with some of those other cases where there might be a geographically based use, but they're, you know, it's open for discussion in terms of whether you look more broadly.
I didn't think it was as open from 37.6 to 40 as it is from 37 to 37.6. That was really I thought that there was more that had already been sort of decided on what the sharing criteria and how it would work up to 40, but that there was a lot of flexibility. And I'm looking a little bit over to Steve because I know we were very engaged in this. True. Would have an impact. That's actually true.
But I just, I would just say it gets difficult sometimes in these groups where you've got an FCC proceeding going on, and then we're trying to specifically deal with those same issues. It can sometimes it can make it more contentious in the groups rather than looking at broader technology issues or broader ways to do sharing or approaches to allowing a cooperative environment.
And we understand that, and that's part of the reason for this discussion.
So would I be correct, Paige, in saying that you definitely want some feedback for the 37 to 37.6, but you're open for broader feedback? Is that a correct way of phrasing it?
If the feedback on 37 to 37.6 causes specific issues and consternation where the dialogue can't be healthy, I'll say, it may not be worth going down that path, but the idea of looking at what would a dynamic sharing scenario look like in millimeter wave, take 37 to 37.6 out of the equation specifically, but just in general, the opportunities for dynamic sharing, what would that look like? Might be a way to do it.
Go ahead, Miriam.
Yeah, can I just say, well, I had another set of questions, but just now on this particular topic. I think one of the things in the report that we identified is that for any solutions for sharing, they will be completely band specific. And I don't, whatever band that's picked or not picked or general, you can't take that and apply it across the board. So if you decide to take 37 to 37.6 and study that can't be applied to another frequency spectrum. So there won't be any general learnings from picking a specific frequency band. It will just be applicable to that. I mean, the example is what happens in AWS-3 sharing is obviously different with what happens in, another spectrum sharing, what your receivers are, what your transmitters are, what are the federal systems operating, and then what 5G application would be used, and every band is going to drive these things. So I think I understand if you wanted to generally look at dynamic sharing, that's one thing, but basically if we do look at 37 to 37.6, it's just for that band. I don't think it's a general 5G study item.
This is, if I can turn to Steve Shark again. I think the one difference here would be, I don't think there are any federal systems in 37 to 37.6 right now, right? I mean, I think it would be, you would have to look at kind of defining some broader sharing scenarios, which is different than AWS 3, where we had very specific things that we were looking at.
So what I'm hearing, kind of in the interest of time, is that there's generally people think we should take this topic on. There's the focus on sharing is good. The 37 to 37.6 is a candidate to look at, but doesn't have to be. And maybe we leave that to the subcommittee to kind of figure out as we go through. Or Paige, you think we need to refine that more now today?
I think we'll take it under consideration. And
Let me ask a question in that context. Are you done, Miriam, or do you?
Well, I had my next question.
Oh, sorry.
Well,
go ahead. Keep going. I do want to make sure we march along, so go ahead.
Okay. The question I had is on the first bullet point. And Paige, you referred to receiver performance earlier in another context, and I'm a little bit confused if we're talking about just receiver performance requirements for 5G or also receiver performance requirements for federal systems, because I think I may have thought that earlier you were talking about receiver performance characteristics or requirements for federal systems as well, because I think what we're facing right now is in this whole sharing existing spectrum band work that's been done, the general approach to it has been, sort of what's there today, what am I bringing in, in the next couple of years, and let's figure this out. And then there's a whole around, well, what happens in the future? So, for example, federal systems, like as part of AWS3 or any other spectrum band, they want flexibility to be able to upgrade their services. They want flexibility to maybe use more of the bandwidth that they're being using today, or do something just different. And that's now becoming sort of like this whole issue that is not clear how it's going to be dealt with. And the same thing, with 5G systems, same thing, networks are going to go through upgrades on both sides. So basically, I think it's important to consider this as both key receiver performance requirements of future commercial services and key performance requirements of future federal services, which is what we were trying to outline in the report, is saying, let's consider 5G being, for everyone, 5G, both federal and commercial. We're all kind of upgrading and changing our networks.
Yeah, a couple things. I would think of it in terms of you might be able to create dual-use technologies that are applicable to government requirements as well as commercial requirements, which could enable certain things. The flexibility in use is a priority for federal systems as well as non-federal systems, so that creates a certain dynamic and challenge. I would say when I talk about receiver characteristics and receiver performance, I'm talking more generally. However, traditionally in the federal environment, we already have some pretty, in some cases, very stringent receiver performance requirements that we tend to institutionalize on our own. So it tends, even though we could have some opportunities to shape receivers on the federal side, that is traditionally what we do anyway, is to tighten the receivers because they're in harsh environments to begin with from a deployment standpoint. So we would, when I talk about it, I talk generally speaking, but in most cases the federal receivers, in my experience, have been pretty tight, relatively speaking, not including certain more generic receivers, maybe GPS, et cetera, in certain cases.
All right, Dale, do you have a question, or are you just putting your tent back up?
No, I
Okay.
have a comment if I could. As somebody who, of course, has been talking about receiver issues for a long, long time, but you know, I think we'd better be served by thinking about interference limits and harm's claim threshold and leave it to the marketplace to come up with a much more marketplace oriented, to let the marketplace figure it out, rather than having us specify actual performance, receiver performance. That ties back then to the enforcement that we're going to talk about. Enforcement, if you know what the interference limit is or something like that, then you can make a determination of if an enforcement action is needed. So I would just point that out. I've advocated, my close friend Pierre DeVries has done an awful lot of work looking at the harm's claim threshold or interference limit as a alternative to detailed receiver specifications.
Okay, thanks, Dale. So I'm going to shut it down right now and reiterate that you want to put your table tent down. For what we're trying to do today is suss out thoughts and ideas, and any way we might refine their question. As these come through, what we'll do within the subcommittees is dig deeper into it, and like what we did last time, especially with the 5G one, we actually recast the question. So there's still room for that, consistent with what NTI is looking for, but we can't litigate the merits of the questions out here, otherwise we'll be here till tomorrow. So what we're trying to do is get thoughts and feedback on the questions, and so having said that, the next one is reconciling U.S. and international spectrum policy. So what we're looking here to do is to, basically you can read this, should the United States develop international recommendations and reports prior to finalizing our domestic rules in order to better harmonize our policies, so that, you know, when we go into work and whatnot, we have some flexibility, which is what they just said. And what types of outreach should we be doing a priori before we go to these things? And so the context of this is basically, for example, coordination of U.S. domestic and international efforts on terrestrial mobile broadband, for example, the Spectrum Frontiers, UAS implementation, and whatever. So the question is, are there any issues where domestic efforts could be hindered by international developments? So that's kind of what we're looking for, is feedback in that regard.
And before we throw it open, we did hear some comments on the email on this one about concerns about making the international work a gate for the domestic work. It was not my interpretation sitting in the room, and Paige can clarify that that's what the intent here was. It was more like to get ahead on the international work, not to make the international work gate. But we did hear several people express those concerns on emails. Mary in particular felt, she wouldn't want to see that happen. There was also some concerns about the political environment. Dennis, I think, shared that with the whole group, that it's not, a favorable time for kind of the international work, but he was still open. Those are kind of what we heard from the folks on the email chain.
And so again, the purpose of today is just socialize some of this, but if you have specific comments, and like what we did before, is send them back to the team which would be us up here, and any of your other colleagues if you want to, but we need to see them as well, your thoughts on that. But having said that, are there any questions that you guys have for the purposes of clarification of the questions?
Or thoughts whether this is a fruitful topic?
Miriam.
Sorry, just to clarify, I didn't comment on this. You said Miriam.
He said Mary.
Mary. Oh, good. Okay, all right.
Jennifer.
So, Jennifer Warren, I think the question, and I have nothing to do with the promulgation of this question, but I think that the question is really, how does the U.S. effectively advance a strategy that benefits U.S. interests, no matter how we define it, whether it be one technology or another. And there seems to be a misperception on what happens in different environments and how they affect industries. And perhaps there is some value that can be brought to this. I'm not an advocate for this, but I certainly think there's been a lot of mischaracterization of the last WRC. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of ill advice that was given, perhaps, to countries that didn't get everything they wanted. But I think there's a lot of lessons learned that could also be brought that I'm not sure is really what NTIA wants as an advisory committee role, but nobody else is looking at it.
Thanks. Paul? I think it's you, right?
Paul Colazzi.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you wanted to, if part of this is to understand the federal and non-federal uses of spectrum and what's going on in other places around the world. Sometimes when you're trying to make plans as to how you want to interact and what's going to happen, sometimes it's better, since we're no longer the driving force economically in this area. I mean, the whole world is expanding. Is there a chance that you want to take a look at how they're formulating their responses and how their federal systems and non-federal systems are interacting as a possible mechanism for us to understand how we might want to do work in our own system? I know that's sort of like not self-gratiating. We always like to say that we're the leaders.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I exactly followed it, but we do have a lot of insight, I think, in the vein that you were discussing in terms of working with other administrations, other militaries, other entities to try to understand positions and or how they're coordinating and how they're advocating. I think this was driven, I think, largely from the challenges and maybe somewhat misinformed or misperceived, but challenges and perceptions that the U.S. was getting ahead of international. Should we wait or not? Or do we move forward, and if folks don't follow, what are those implications in terms of global scale and markets? And I think the idea was to better understand, is there a better way than what we're doing today to more strategically position, advocate, sequence these activities? And I'll ask Steve, am I characterizing this correctly?
Okay, I have Christopher, then Charla, and then Carolyn, and that's the questions. That's it. So go ahead, Christopher.
Sure, thanks. Chris Wiesler. So first I would say I think this is a great topic, or a really important topic. We spend a lot of time engaging with spectrum authorities outside the U.S., and to the extent that there's good alignment between what the U.S. is doing with, let's say, the ITU and some other sort of countries, the UK, I think, is another one. It just makes it easier for, I'll describe them as less sophisticated spectrum authorities to make decisions about policy and try to do things in a consistent way. So I think that's the first point I would make. I also, have kind of felt the tension between policy keeping up with the pace of technology and trying to push institutions like the ITU to make sure that the framework that they facilitate is addressing that. I guess one question I would pose for this group is this topic a good topic for the CSMAC, given that there are other important stakeholders, whether it's FCC, state, that would certainly have a lot of input into this. So it's just, as a new person here, I don't know if that's a good question to ask or if it's obvious to everyone else, but I would just pose it.
Okay, that's a good question. Charla, Carolyn, and then Janice and Steve, and that's it.
Sure. Just to reiterate some of what I had said in my note to you guys, Charla Rath, Verizon, sorry. I liked the way Jennifer sort of ordered and characterized this as sort of talking about how can we put U.S. interests first. What I don't like is when we suggest that there might be some reason to wait. Having lived through, in the course of my career, a lot of these cases where we actually were sort of one step ahead of the regulatory authority. And, I have to say, one very interesting was at the last WRC, there was agreed that 700 megahertz should actually be, permitted. You should be able to have a mobile allocation in that. And we had, of course, launched, 7 years earlier on that spectrum. And I think for us to actually suggest to even explore that topic as though it makes some sense for U.S. policy to kind of wait and follow, I actually am worried about the way it was characterized just now by you, Paige, and maybe I may still be misunderstanding.
To gate, it was just bigger picture. How do we gain the most out of the different activities and sequencing to again include that if we do something domestically, depending on what that is, does it hurt us from a market or scale perspective if we do it in more of a isolation?
Yeah, and
to what's
obviously
being done
all those
internationally?
issues are very important, to our industry, to how we operate, and I would agree on that. I just worry our system here is perceived, I know, as being really messy, and how we kind of go off and just do things the way we want to do, and the U.S. is always, sort of, seen that way, particularly in the mobile area, and frankly, it's also been fairly successful at when it does that. But, again, I don't have an issue with looking at this from a broader perspective, the way you just described it now. And I also, as several people around this room know, is that I'm somewhat a novice at these things. I pop in and out of the international side, every few years for the last, 20, 25 years or so. So I don't know it as well as a lot of people who are sitting in this room. And I know that frankly, is actually something that I think could be very helpful to help understand that process a little bit better and help put some clarity on it, which might, I don't know whether that's a CSMAC process or it gets back to what Chris was saying. It might be just something for the government to think about doing. Because it is, for people who come in and out of it and aren't involved in it regularly, it is an incredibly complicated process. And I have to say that often people that I work with internally are sort of a little perplexed as to what, the bottom line value is, and I don't mean that in a negative way. That came out kind of the wrong way, but it's because it is so hard to understand if you're not a practitioner. So anyway, that's my little speech.
I think it's Carolyn, and now I see Brian's is up. So I ask you to make your comments brief. That's all. Okay, go ahead, Carolyn.
So my comment is I think a lot of the issues we're facing in spectrum nationally also other countries are facing with, and so to collaborate, leverage R&D, work together, conduct some outreach is helpful. Also, the international process that we have is relatively slow, taking years, and so maybe some more informal collaboration would be beneficial.
Thank you. Thank you for being brief, too. Janice?
I like the topic. I'm not sure that it's sufficiently defined to really study this year. I look at this, it's just all over the map, right? I mean, the simplest question I can ask that I think is a correct question is how can we best advance U.S. interests internationally? We could all agree that that would be a good thing to do. However, you look at the fight that went on in WRC between the satellite sector and the terrestrial broadband sector that played itself out and continues to play itself out. When you get into the specifics, it gets messy really quickly. And then, I go way back when to the old GSM CDMA thing where, there's a lot of flagellation. If you look at standards, we're always self-flagellating. Should we be more collaborative or should we do the old American independence thing? In that case, the American independence thing worked pretty darn well for this country. And so it's just it's a complicated matter. I don't think it's sufficiently worked out. And certainly to state the obvious, there's, a new team in town, and that doesn't mean it's going to necessarily have the right answers, but I think it will help define the discussion.
All right, thanks. One of the things that you can do, as I said a minute ago, is send questions. If you think there's more on this that you think would make the question more appropriate, feel free to send it back and keep it on the on the topic. Steve and then Brian, and that's it. Of course, I said that before, but
yeah, Steve Sharkey, T-Mobile.
Yeah.
So I think I would look at it from two sides, right? It's how do you advantage the U.S. and what's the right timing for going out with information to work with the rest of the world, and how does that help us? It's also how do we prevent some of the international process from negatively impacting what we're doing in the U.S. Because frankly, going into work 2015, there were papers going out, and it wasn't just from industry. There were papers from federal agencies that went out with technical studies that seemed to be directly opposed to studies that were going on in the U.S. Through our domestic process, and was a little surprising to see that. And I think that's then that does get to be used as leverage to come back and impacts and certainly in the AWS 3 discussions, not necessarily for those studies, but we see a lot of the assumptions that go into those international studies that are maybe not as widely reviewed amongst the full parties of interest that come back with putting limitations on our options for sharing or for technology.
Okay. And Brian?
Yes, I'll be fast.
I know you will.
So 2 quick things, I guess. One is I do agree it's a very important topic. I have significant concerns about whether or not this is the right place to do it. Okay. There are a variety of institutional actors, including the State Department, which has an advisory committee, including the FCC, which has an advisory committee, and I'm just not sure that this is the right venue to try and tackle it. Moreover, I would be concerned, and I suspect other members would as well, about development of any sort of prescriptive approach going forward, where I'm pretty sure that one of the strengths of the U.S. system has been adapting to each circumstance in a way that is advantageous for us. So I just think it has a lot of peril in this venue, and so I would not be inclined to include this.
Okay, that's a no vote. Thank you. That was good. All right, moving along. The next question is enforcement. And basically, I would characterize it as looking for ways to automate enforcement. There's several questions that characterize that, but basically, in an ex post fashion, so trying to stop interference before it happens, how can we automate? Charla?
Well, let me review what we got over the email, because I want to respect that people did send in emails here. So, got a few emails in saying it's an important topic. Charlotte did have some concerns about maybe there was some exhaustion here, but definitely the focus on harmful interference was suggested by Dennis, and also the focus on automation. Carolyn mentioned that it would be good to consider both receiver and transmitter and have some discussion about what is acceptable and unacceptable risk. So there wasn't really too much objection, just the worry about exhaustion and the focus. That's what we got on the email.
Okay. I think Dennis?
Yeah, just one other comment that was in my list.
Yeah.
You clicked them off pretty well, but the one other thing that I pointed out was the potential to examine what other people are doing, particularly Germany, but there are a few others, Singapore and so on, that we might look at as a component of this, which we haven't really done in the past, because there are other people out there, per the last topic, that are doing things in our space in the world, and learning from them to the degree that we can seems like a really valuable step that we could add into this working group activities.
Okay, so that would be a work item for the group. Is that you, Rick?
Yes.
Okay.
Right down. I support this this topic. I think it's a very, very important and good one. And I also think, as Dennis said, we ought to look at what other countries are doing in this regard. And I think this has a lot. Not only does it play into enforcement, but I think it also plays into some of the myths of sharing. Because if you have a system out there that actually is looking at things, and you have to look at, there's all these issues about the data and all that, but you might get a real picture of what's really happening rather than a lot of anecdotal data that we seem to toss about. So I'm in favor of this.
Okay, thank you. I think it's 2 votes for. Any other? Janice?
There has been a lot of work done here, and going into the new administration with, some opportunity here, I would strongly urge that we go forward on at least some parts of this. One is the idea of building in enforceability, automating enforcement. And, that's a sooner rather than later issue in terms of rules FCC's writing for various services, how things are, come into the U.S., et cetera, because we're never going to have the sharing that I think we all would think is optimal in certain circumstances if it's not built into the equipment. It's just not going to happen.
Rick, you're done, right? Put your thing. Okay. All right. Thanks. That's a good. In fact, that's one of the contexts that the NTI puts to this is think about this in the context, like for example, 3.5 gig and other and also 5G. So there may be some overlaps. Dale.
Somewhat surprising I support this.
I was surprised your tent wasn't up first, but that's okay.
One thing I would say, we talk about enforcement stuff, it's going back to the 3GPP stuff, is 3GPP building in the hooks that we need for enforcement here in the U.S. And there's a whole set of, and I won't take your time now, but I have a whole set of concerns along those lines.
Great, thanks. Okay. I think this one will probably move forward. Any thoughts? Did you want to say anything? Okay. All right. The next one is, I think one that a lot of people will find good, is the process for identifying suitable bands for repurposing. Basically, what process? I think what NTI is looking for is what do commercial users look for in terms of spectrum that's of interest beyond. I mean, obviously, a lot of that's been documented, certainly in the records on rulemakings and whatnot. But I think putting that into a sort of compendium discussion that this topic is trying to suss out is kind of what NTI is looking for. So do you want to?
Yeah, so from an email perspective, this had a lot of support on the email. A number of people said that they particularly liked this topic. Charla said this is exactly what CSMAC should be doing, and it had strong support. There were a couple of questions. Paul A. said, could we incorporate the NTA's quantitative assessment into this work? Carolyn has had a number of questions here regarding technology advancement impacts and what exclusions or percentage of spectrum is acceptable for meeting commercial requirements. But generally, I found the email to be very supportive of this topic.
Any questions for Jennifer?
Well, not questions for me, but
whatever.
Jennifer Warren. So I think this is a good question, and since Larry had originally explained why we don't have spectrum sharing as a topic, this makes sense. But I think the third part of this, what particular commonalities or compatibilities between federal and commercial interests, is actually the newer part of the discussion, and something that we haven't even begun to discuss, really. And I would like to suggest that we prioritize that over some of these other elements. And then my second point, so that's point one. My second point would be that, again, this is a little bit, particularly if you look at question 2 under there, it's a little one-sided. And again, it's not looking at what Paige talked about before, and I think Carolyn mentioned, et cetera, is what are the growth expectations of the federal side? And again, I think that needs to be rolled in, because that impacts what is able to be repurposed or shared, and how can it be shared if they both have great demands for growth. So I think a little bit more work on this from my perspective, but with a real emphasis on 3. Thank you.
Thank you. Put your tent down.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Any other thoughts?
Tent management is very awesome.
Okay, cool, okay. Okay, the next one then is, developing the next generation of spectrum professionals. So as Glenn said, we're all smart in this room. So how do we make that smarts go out to other people in the context of spectrum management? A lot of us are engineers, a lot of us are lawyers. So the thought is basically, how do we institutionalize that? Did you come out of the womb wanting to be a spectrum engineer, a spectrum professional? Probably not. So generally thoughts around basically how you can institutionalize that, in the context of,
And I wanted to highlight talking about evolving requirements. So what does industry see that the spectrum professionals need, 5-10 years out? And then how do we sufficiently get that expertise into the workforce? So also thinking out into the future, what do those roles look like and what skill sets would be needed to execute?
Larry?
From an email perspective, we didn't get a lot of comments, but they took an interesting shape. There was a number of people who were saying, like, this isn't my thing. It's not my thing. And not super excited about it. But then there was, Dennis, I thought, had the most interesting thing, saying, I'm not sure we can do anything here, but I can talk for hours about it. And Dennis, so there was kind of a view that, so I would characterize the email as like some concerns about us being able to actually address the issue materially. Some people feeling like it's not their interest, but we do actually on this panel, I believe, have some good representation that could bring something to the issue. So I think that's true, but the email wasn't really definitive of interest. As a matter of fact, I think it's an important discussion here today to see, do people want to take this on, or do people think the NTA should take it on? That's the question that I think we got to put out to people.
Rick?
So Rick Reese from Raytheon. I read Dennis's comments and I decided to shut up on email, but let me give you my view of the world about this. I think it's a critical issue. And one of the things I've taken on is I'm developing a spectrum management competency model along with a spectrum E3 competency model for my company. And because on some of these obscure areas, it's very, very difficult to find people to do that. And as you probably know, Peter, he knows nothing about this. I had this long talk with him about hiring him, and I'm saying with my EQ guys about you need to make a long-term commitment to this field. And then the issue is what training, what things should they be able to do, and figuring that all out is very, very important. I think a lot of people in the spectrum world think it's all about making assignments and processing certifications. It's actually much, much broader than that, and there's lots of other facets to it, although there are not very many people in that. And we don't have a lot of people that are very young doing this. So I've actually had all my office has taken the Anne Arundel course, by the way. They've all, for those of you done that, they've all done that. They've all been to the LCID course. They've all been to Spectrum 21. They've all taken the training. Determining competency, though, is another whole issue about whether they're capable, qualified, and competent to do spectrum management functions. And so that's one of the things I'm kind of looking at with my staff about doing that, and have a very good staff, as you probably know, to figure that out. I think it's very important, but the thing that will drive this, though, is by having more spectrum-related requirements in government acquisitions. Right now, you know, I'm doing, I have 1,000 other things going here, but I have a lot of contracts from major contractors in this room where there are absolutely no spectrum requirements in the specification, in the statement of work, or anything. And we all know that we need to go do that, but we're not forcing that in a lot of our contracting work. If you did that, and there were spectrum concerns and issues and deliverables and design things that had to be done, then you would force industry and other people to step up to actually doing the work, because they'd have to have competent people to actually go off and do these things. So that's been another one of the issues with respect to that. So I do think it's a real issue. I think that there's some recommendations that could be done. It was very interesting to come up with what coursework and training people could take to come work in my shop. You know, that was a difficult problem. We spent years figuring that out. What do you really have to do? Because the company has all these rules about, you know, competency and so forth. And so I think it's important. But until we start, it gets back to enforcing. And so we start enforcing the rules and making industry do some of these things about how we do sharing designs and so forth. You're not going to see a groundswell of support for people to man up and do this kind of work in their companies. The reason we've been successful is we've had a lot of issues in the company, the compliance stuff like that. So that's how our shop got stood up a decade ago, was because of issues within the company about paying better attention to this. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm sure you didn't mean man up either, but
put my 10
person up. Okay, I see Janice, but I think before that was Alan. Go ahead. Who is an educator, probably has thoughts on this.
Yeah, Alan McKenzie from Virginia Tech. I mean, I do think this is a really important issue, and it's one you were kind of asking if there was interest in the issue. It's certainly one that I am very professionally interested in. That said, from my experience as an engineering educator, it's very hard to get engineering students interested in this, even at the graduate level. We've tried to run some courses on spectrum management and spectrum policy and so on, and it's been very difficult to get students into those courses. And it's also maybe a little bit unclear to me what role what role CSMAC can play in this, which is not to say that there's not one, just that, of course, I'm new to the committee, so I don't know what role we could play. But,
okay, that's great,
just
thanks.
a little unclear.
I think, is that Brian or Jennifer?
Oh, Jennifer.
It's Jennifer, okay, Jennifer. And then Roy?
Jennifer Warren. I agree it's an important topic, but I think this is not probably the best place for it. What I would ask NTIA to consider is either on their own doing an NOI or RFI, whatever be the appropriate thing, to get much broader contributions from academia and technology firms, et cetera, or work with OSTP on, you know, as part of their STEM. I think it's really important, and as a company that is always in search of not just RF engineers but competent ones, this is important, but again, with different placement. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Roy?
Andy Roy Asri. I view this as one of those topics that's important but not urgent. Because we will talk about it and say, you know, we have 5G and other things that are key priorities, and then 10 years down the line, suddenly this is urgent because we haven't developed that process, that back end that we need to support functions. how you do it and where to do it is an interesting question. Most people I've met who deal in this sort of work have fallen into it. And they weren't going through school saying, I'm going to do spectrum. And in fact, talking to most RF engineers, they think it's this weird niche area that involves lots of travel and not too sure what it is. So I think it's important. I'm not too sure how we would address it in this meeting. I would say on the comment about whether it's education or experience, there's definitely experience that needs to be in there. An example was used, I tried to teach my new engineer about the ITU. He didn't believe me until he actually turned up and saw what happened. There's definitely an experience.
It does have to be experienced.
Go through that. But also the education piece, I think, does need to be considered. Even down to the practical level, the budgets are being squeezed and not many people are attending these spectrum meetings as before. And previously where you had 3 or 4 people from the same company of different experience levels, that's now being reduced down further to 1 or 2. And suddenly, as a new person going in, you haven't got that backup there immediately as well. So there's certainly an element of that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you. Again, emails back to us. That one was the one that kind of we felt was the most, the least of, vulnerable. I wouldn't say least interest, but maybe not fit into the scheme of things, especially since we're trying to down select. Finally, and last but by certainly no means least, is incentives and spectrum efficiency. So this was a topic of the 2011 instance of CSMAC, and so there's been some things that have happened since then. In the context of this, obviously there's lots of things that have happened since then. And so the one thing is 2 things actually. The OMB-11, that's been, to the extent that that's been changed, how would the changes influence that discussion moving forward? And obviously the SRF, the Spectrum Relocation Fund, and changes in that. So the idea behind this question is to go back and take a look at that and sort of renew the recommendations based on the new information in those 2 documents. Is there anything else? Pretty much, I think that's pretty much it. So thoughts on that? I see heads going up and down, so I think people are kind of interested.
I'll give the email. So there was a number of comments on the email. Michael Calabrese, who co-chaired a lot of the work that led to the Spectrum Relocation Fund modifications, thought this was a good topic, and he suggested changing the wording to say something like, since the SRF has been broadened since 2011, we were interested in whether further expansion or a new SIF would be useful. So definitely Michael was supportive. Charlotte was supportive, thinking this is a tricky topic, but one we should engage in. And I think Carolyn felt that we should think broader than incentives. How should both federal agencies can become more efficient in spectrum use? I do think the word incentive, my personal view, that this isn't really a discussion about incentives. I think the topic, when you read the question, is really about the funding mechanisms and around the SRF, but we heard that comment come in, and Dennis also thought it's an important topic to wrestle with, although he felt that wasn't his skill area. And
all right, Brian, you get the first.
I'll just go quickly. I believe we were part of this. We did this the first time as an originalist, and for the 2011 recommendation that eventually ended up OMB Circular 11 that ended up in the legislation. I think it'd be useful to go back to see to what degree that's worked or not worked, and what the ramifications are of it. And so I like this topic in part because it helps us check our work to see if what we're doing makes sense and what we can learn how we did that, even as an institution, CSMAC plus CSMAC, but also about how the budget process can be harnessed to create positive incentives for, especially in light of the change legislation, to do the right thing on spectrum efficiency and things like that.
Well, and probably there may be new recommendations to make. It's not to go back and do more busy work, but to the extent that these documents have moved the ball down the field a little more, is there anything more feeding back to NTIA that's pertinent? Yeah. Steve?
Yeah, I'll just quickly, I mean,
Steve Sharkey.
Steve Sharkey. I think it's a great topic and would support doing it. I think there's been good progress with the SRF and with change that have been made, and I think we are seeing some positive reaction to that, and anything we can do to move that along is good. And this is a good group, I think, to do it.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this? I've forgotten people on the phone. I assume that if you were on the phone and had thoughts, you would say something, but maybe not. So is there anybody on the phone that had thoughts on this topic or any of the previous ones? Sorry about that.
Yeah, Mark.
Hey, Michael.
This is, it's Mike.
Michael, you're breaking up. That's better. It sounds like you may be near some sort of a Wi-Fi access point that's causing interference into your cordless phone.
Nice. Probably a wireless microphone.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm on it. Calling connection.
So-
In any event, I'll try to be quick. Larry, pretty much.
Hey, Michael, we're getting like every third word, and we're not.
gonna work, Michael.
It's not going to work. Maybe if you can make another call in, or send an email. We'd really love to get your thoughts on this, but we can't hear you. So.
Yeah, I can't recall if Michael sent his email to the whole group.
Yeah,
or
he did
just us.
send. Yeah, he sent an email to us, I think. So.
Yeah.
Sorry, Michael.
But I know he's supportive of the topic.
That's fine.
Rick.
Right.
It's Rick Reeser, Raytheon. I vote yes, and I was on the original OMB circular committee that was implemented beyond our wildest dreams.
Thank you. Okay, any other thoughts? Okay. We got it done 8 minutes early. Thank you.
Paige, I'd just like to ask,
Yeah.
did you get what you needed from this? Do you have any further comments?
I don't have any further comments. I think this was a good discussion. I would encourage folks that think of additional comments or didn't get their comments in, if you could send them over the next week for consideration as we take this back and deliberate in terms of priorities and the topics that we want to select. And if you have, as Mark said, if you have suggestions in terms of language, how to tighten it, how to reorient it, that you would like us to consider, please send those in as well. But I appreciate the discussion.
Thanks, Paige. Okay, I just want to reiterate one more thing, just so it's clear. Would like to get feedback on the committees you'd like to, or subcommittees you'd like to be part of by the end of next week, if possible. It should be easy. Easy. I mean, the comments on those could be. You could have a couple weeks on that. Say by the end of the week after next.
You haven't told us which ones.
Yeah, Mark. I think
Yeah,
you're getting ahead. We're gonna take the feedback. We'll take the feedback on these.
You haven't told us which ones.
Yeah, Mark. I think
Yeah,
you're getting ahead. We're gonna take the feedback. We'll take the feedback on these. We'll announce the subcommittees, the
that's
questions,
fine.
and then people can.
Okay. Well, I thought whatever. Miriam. Yeah.
Thanks. I just had a general question because I noticed a few folks were like saying, "I vote no, I vote yes." Is there a voting process over here? Because I wasn't sure.
NTA is going to propose the questions based on the feedback they've received. So even if you vote no, they might say, "We want input on this question."
Okay, I'm just trying to make sure that when
There's
we
no
say-
voter fraud going on here. Not in CSMAC. But I mean, most of these, everybody is just supporting the concept. That's all.
You're just getting the comments in.
All right, got it.
Okay, so just to reiterate, what am I reiterating? I don't need to. I get myself in trouble. I think you guys know what the assignment is. So having said all that, I think we're now to the schedule. No, actually, opportunity for public comment. So anybody in the public wish to make comment in the room first? Okay. Anybody on the phone wish to make public comment? Okay, no comments from the public. Okay, I think now is the schedule. So.
Yeah. The schedule and the closing.
Yeah.
So I think we've discussed pretty much the schedule already. I don't think there's any more to add. Just to beat the horse, we'll take the feedback. Expect to hear over email. I think one of the things that's going to be different, we're going to try and accomplish a lot over email and setting up subcommittees and getting them going by the next meeting. This is something we haven't been that successful in the past. So we're definitely going to try and run a cadence here to get these subcommittees stood up so that they're meeting and active in March and could have had one meeting at least before the next CSMAC, which I don't think we have a calendar date for, but April is the target. David, do you have late April, early May? So that'll be our goal, get the subcommittee stood up, everyone signed up for theirs, have a meeting, and then we'll come back here in April or late May. So that's the schedule.
I just asked for the newbies. I think you guys have made it a practice once a year to meet out in Boulder.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us what month that has been in the past?
It's usually the summer meeting. Which
Usually it's coexistent with the ISART, and the ISART's moved around a bit. Do you have anything on that, David? Okay.
Late July. So
Okay.
Okay.
it's not decided. Right now, they're looking at this.
But we would want to try to make it happen at the same time, or
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we usually try to do one out there just because. Okay. But as Larry said, we want to have roughly 4 meetings, big meetings this year, because that sort of like a quarterly cadence, so to speak, plus or minus. Okay.
Yeah, so we're thinking kind of April, May, then one at the ISART, and then a fall meeting.
Yeah.
Probably October, November.
Yep. Okay. I guess it's time for closing remarks.
I have the closing, I think.
You have to close. Yeah.
All right, so for closing remarks, so again, on just following up on this process, we will kind of, if you have strong interest in any of these topics, let us know, but we will contact people we think would be appropriate co-chairs once the topics get formulated, and we'll try and have a mix of expertise on for co-chairs of the different groups. And then we'll have the general sign up in February. Participation is super important, so again, at least sign up for one group minimum. And you don't feel like you have to sign up for more, but if you want to sign up for more, subject to your own timing constraints, will be great. There's an expectation that you'll participate yourself. You're the member of the group. Your staff is not the members of the group. If you're using a staff person to listen, take notes for you because you can't be there on occasion, that's fine. I know Janice has done that, and that's been fine. But generally, it's your participant as the advisory committee member is expected. And you represent also yourself. You're employed by a company, but that's actually not directly relevant. You're representing kind of your own views as an advisor. And again, the subcommittee will decide on their own how often to meet once the subcommittee chairs formulate. The focus will be on getting recommendations. This is especially true for the new people. There's kind of a history of big documents in the past, and while that's fine, has background material, reference material, it's not necessary, and it's not the main thing that the NTA wants. The main thing the NTA wants is the actionable recommendations. So we'll boil those down into a few key highlighted things. If there's material behind it, great, not required. I remind everyone we all have other jobs. This is an advisory aspect, so it's to tap collective wisdom. People are not expected to go out and do primary research, simulation yourself. That would be above and beyond. But coming up with the recommendations is key. Meeting locations, I had this on my notes, and I just realized we've kind of moved out of meeting in the Commerce Building for a couple of reasons. One, it's been under renovation, and 2, it's a very difficult process to get in and out of the building. It's time consuming. So really appreciate Charlotte and Verizon hosting us today, and we'll probably look for other venues like that. So if you have a venue in the DC area that you think would be suitable, let David know so that we can maybe take advantage of that. And this is an ideal venue so people can see this is the kind of venue that we're looking for. And we will also be probably meeting in Boulder, as we just discussed. So I think those were the closing remarks. I don't think there's anything else that I had for closing remarks. Are there any other questions?
Did you want to open it up for the phone? Usually you do.
I have.
Yeah, questions for the phone. We already opened up for public comment, so that part's over.
I have one other question. A while back, we started this thing about some kind of NTIA portal and signing it and putting documents there. Whatever happened to that, or is that just dead? Just curious.
Well, I do know, and I can comment and then turn his face. So they did create something. It turned out to be quite cumbersome, and so the few of us that tried to utilize said this is not going to work, and I don't think there's been any follow-up since. But maybe David.
And I took all that training.
David, do you have comments on that?
So just to revisit, I think the purpose was to enable more pervasive sharing between the subcommittees in particular, so folks would know where information was, they would have access to it, versus each subcommittee having their own repository, et cetera. So that was the driver that I recall. Whether it's too cumbersome to successfully use, and whether anyone really cares if the subcommittees are talking to each other, it's really your call, but it was a way to enable communication and collaboration across the committee.
I'd add some color. It actually was, it came out of the AWS 3 CSMAC work. We were actually using a portal that Lion was managing to share really a lot of, that was where there was a lot of heavy lifting being done, a lot of studies being done. There was just a lot of really in the dirt kind of work. There was a lot of documents being created and sent back and forth. So the Alliant developed this really great portal for all the 5 working groups or subcommittees or whatever we called them at the time. And that, the what we tried to do here that Rick's referring to sort of came out of that. It kind of got bogged down with just a lot of stuff. And so I think in the end it probably would be nice to have something like that, but it's not critical. Yeah, right.
I would suggest that we abandon it and then let the IT guys at NTIA focus on other issues and just close it out, because by the time I got ready to do it, I was exhausted.
Yeah, but you got all that training, so
I got all that training though.
You're now a Spectrum manager.
By the way, I shared some of the IT training with my company. They thought it was pretty interesting, to be honest.
Okay. I'm going to check. Anybody on the phone have questions or comments? CSMAC people? Okay. All right, great.
So then just to wrap up, what we're going to do is we're going to adjourn the meeting, and then the members should stay for the ethics training. That will not be recorded on the video, and we'll have the ethics training. And then after that, Charlotte will be conducting a tour of the facility for anyone.
Anybody who wants to stick around. You don't have to, but if you want to, feel free.
And I'm not
give you a tour.
Was there going to be a social gathering afterwards?
Dave was.
Well, we hadn't really formally planned anything, but as I said in my email, if there's an interest for people to stick around to get to know each other more, have further discussions, just let us know. We can do that. Charlotte has some
Yeah, there are a couple of places right
Okay,
downstairs.
yeah. So we'll have an informal discussion about that afterwards. So I think, unless otherwise, we'll adjourn the
I think it's just a quick question on the logistics for the training. So I think we have some people on the phone. Eric's going to be doing the training on the phone. So are you going to close the bridge and then bring it back up, or?
The teleconference we can keep on. We're just going to close the bridge.
Okay. Oh, so not any non-CSMAC people that would be on the phone bridge. Just respectfully ask you to get off, if you would, please. Unless you want to get ethics training. It will not make you a Spectrum engineer, though. I'm just saying. All right, that's it. The meeting's adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great comments and feedback. Thank you.